Hello and welcome to the Witness Podcast, a place where we explore what it means to be witnesses of Jesus Christ. We hope you enjoy this episode. So this is official episode number 2 so last time we did my testimony. Still today, we're doing Megan's testimony. So this is the third episode / second. Megan, I've never actually heard your testimony. I know bits of it, but I've never heard you say it in full. So I'm really excited. So I guess we start off with what was your growing up like some context to you?
Yeah, so I mean actually what's really funny about our testimonies is there is just so much overlap. When
Mm.
we filmed yours last week, although if you're watching you will know that that was only about 5 minutes ago that we did that one. Yeah, as I was listening to yours, I was thinking, oh, there's just so much of your story that I'm like, oh yeah, yeah, had that moment. So that was really funny for me. And I imagine you'll probably have the same experience listening to mine. But yeah, so similarly to you, grew up in a Christian household. So my parents became Christians at their youth group when they were teenagers. They both went to the same secondary school. They actually went to the secondary school that I went to, which just
Oh.
blows my mind, really. It feels like such a small world where I grew up. Yeah, so we grew up in church and we're just like really, really involved. So it was quite a big church. And from I think as young as I can remember, really, both my parents were really involved. My dad was a deacon. So it was a Baptist church that I grew up in. I think I might be way off, but I think a deacon in a Baptist church is sort of the equivalent of a PCC member in an Anglican church. I think he was a deacon, so very involved. He's also very handy, so he was always involved in like stuff that needed fixing at church. Also musical, so he was part of the worship team for like as long as I can remember, really. And then when I think I was probably about 10, my mum then started working for the church as the families worker. So she did all sorts of great stuff like running marriage courses, doing marriage prep with couples, running parenting courses, lots of that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I grew up there literally from essentially the day I was born until I was 18. Lived out my teenage years at that church, which was great. Had really great youth work, great youth worker. I mean, basically, just like my whole kind of social existence happened at church because there were so many young people and I just had a really good group of friends. I had like a good group of friends in secondary school and a good group of friends at church as well. And there was a bit of an overlap between the two. It was just a great time. Just had a lot of fun. And our youth worker was also, there was definitely like a bit of a rhythm of you hit sort of 16-ish and because there were so many young people, it just sort of made sense that like the older ones then started investing in the younger ones. So once we got to 16, it was like, great, do you want to help run a small group with some of the younger young people? So I was doing that from when I was about 16, like writing sessions for 13, 14-year-old girls. Which is crazy. Now you look back on it and I'm like, why did anybody let me do that? That's wild. But yeah, so church was just a huge part of my life, really. Quite enjoyed school for the most part. Primary school had a great time. Secondary school, quite enjoyed it. Sixth form, absolutely hated, had the worst time in sixth form. There were some girls who I had known at secondary school, and we all kind of like lived in the same area, who, when we went to sixth form, I think I probably had like my first, maybe not my first, but the first moment I can really recollect of like feeling quite convicted about the people that I was spending a lot of time with and I guess the influence that that was having on me. So I think I really noticed at sixth form that a lot of what we talked about was just about other people and generally not particularly nice stuff about other people. And I think quite soon into my first year of sixth form, I just was like, I could feel myself doing the same. So like I would just
Yeah.
join with those conversations. And I think for a while I thought it was fine that I didn't often kind of initiate the conversation, but I think the more I was around it, it was definitely the Holy Spirit nudge of, this is not what you should be doing. So essentially tried to distance myself from them at sixth form, didn't kind of communicate anything to them. I'm just going to try not to hang out with them as much, which they took offense to, which I kind of get. We look back and we think, oh, maybe if I'd actually communicated something, that would have gone better, but I didn't because I was too scared. So distanced myself from them and it got really unpleasant. And then that just continued through the rest of sixth form, really. They just didn't like me. I can imagine from their perspective that it looked like I'd just ditched them without communicating why. So I get it, but I think the thing is then that you kind of become a bit of a target for some of the stuff
Yeah.
that you were trying to distance yourself from. So yeah, I did not have the best time. And then moved away at 18. I was about 4 hours away to go to uni in a city that I'd never been to, which was crazy. So I grew up in Southampton and then moved up to Cambridge for university. And disclaimer that I always feel like I need to give, I did not go to Cambridge University because I'm not that clever. I went to Anglia Ruskin, which is affectionately known by the University of Cambridge as the Early Learning Centre, which does a lot for your self-esteem at 18 years old. So that's nice. But yeah, so that was my first step into semi-adult life and a bit of freedom. I was very far away from home in a place that was so unfamiliar to me. So I remember Freshers Week, I being somewhat of an introvert, it was a real battle for me around the only way I'm going to make friends and not be really lonely is if I go to these events and if I'm really intentional about getting to know people. But the introvert in me was like, this is my biggest nightmare. I went to a Christian Union social event in Freshers Week. It was like a picnic in the park or something. And I remember vividly, I actually even remember what she was wearing, but I remember walking across this park in the middle of the city centre towards this group of people and saw this girl sat with them. And I was like, she looks friendly. I'm just going to make a beeline for her and she will be my friend. I just decided that. And 13 years later, we're still really good friends.
Oh,
Her firstborn is my godson. It was the start of some really good friendships as well for me going to uni. I think my story is probably going to be a bit backwards and forwards as well, but I think something that was really significant for me through my growing up, probably from 12, 13, was just having a real internal struggle with my mind. I think looking back now, I probably was struggling with some sort of depression from about 12, 13, and that definitely got worse through my teenage years and kind of worse in like peaks and troughs through my 20s. And then that kind of then got coupled with anxiety as well. So it really felt like my teenage years and my kind of early adulthood had this undertone of, I mean, it sounds really melodramatic, but darkness is the only way I can think to
yeah.
describe it. When I look back on who I was then, I think outwardly I presented as somebody who was fine the majority of the time. Like growing up as a child, had always been quite a cheerful kid, and I think I did a reasonable job of maintaining that outwardly as a teenager because I think I probably felt like that was what was expected of me. But underneath the surface, just was not doing well, really. I probably only realized when probably a couple of years ago, and I imagine this is something that you will be able to resonate with. You sort of only realize how bad it was when you come out the other
Yeah.
side of it and you feel what it is to feel better. And then you look back and you're like, oh, did I just exist in that space for that long?
Yeah.
What was that? So I had a lot of that going on, whilst being really involved in church and whilst very much still having a faith. But I think I also, we obviously grew up in different eras, and the way that mental health and mental well-being and our emotions are talked about now is quite different even to 10 years ago when I was growing up. And so it was starting to be talked about. It wasn't something that was talked about in school, really. It wasn't something that my parents had grown up talking about. And so I think I had a very, I think probably from being an introvert and having like quite an awareness of what's going on internally for me, I had quite an awareness that stuff was not good, but just really lacked the ability to articulate what was going on. And I mean, to some extent, if you're not able to talk about it and people don't recognize it in you, you just exist in it for years, which is what happened. So I was still struggling with a lot of that through uni and then out of university. I had so little hope for like what my future was going to be. I didn't even want to think about my future because it felt scary, but also it just felt like just too much for me to cope with the idea of feeling like this for longer. So finished uni, I moved back home then for a year and worked in retail and just had a real year of I just don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. Was looking at jobs, found a job with a charity in London, and I'd always wanted to move to London. And so was like, this is it. This is the moment I've been waiting for. This is going to change my life. It's what I've always wanted. And it was a charity that they do multiple things, but the kind of sector of the charity that I worked in was with disadvantaged young people. So young people who had grown up in really tough family settings or struggled with their mental health or had struggled academically or just for all sorts of reasons, who as a result weren't in education or employment or any kind of training and basically just needed support to figure that out to be able to move into the next step for them. And so we ran 6-week programs, basically just focusing on stuff like confidence and communication and how to be professional and how to write your CV, how to apply for a job, how to interview for a job, stuff like that, which was great. And the charity it was a Christian charity, but the program that we were running was not explicitly Christian, so you like weren't free to talk about faith basically unless
Yeah.
you were asked about faith. Because it was a Christian program, it was like all the centers that were running this program were hosted by churches across London. And so we were kind of part of the staff team and kind of not part of the staff team. And so what that meant was like on a Monday morning, we'd join in with the staff team as they kind of talked about this is what's going on for our ministry and this is what's going on here and this is what's going really well, this is what's not going so well. We'd join in for that kind of stuff, then we'd have a time of praying and worshiping together and then we'd leave. And I remember like over the months that I worked there, just having this stronger and stronger sense of like, that's where I want to be. I don't want to be leaving when they start talking about the church ministry stuff. I want to still be there. And I had one particular day where, for all sorts of reasons, the thought of leaving and figuring out doing something else was kind of getting bigger and bigger in my mind. And I don't often get pictures from God. Generally, it's like a bit of a sense of something or it's words or a phrase. And so this is like the clearest picture I think I've ever had from God. And the way that I've always described it, and I don't even think it's a thing anymore. Do you remember the old British gas adverts? It would have it was like cartoony and it would have lots of different globes just floating around in space with a house on it and a car and like a tree sticking off the side and like people walking and the British gas van would just drive through space and like park up next to the little world. Do you know what I
That
mean?
sounds familiar.
Yeah. So I literally that's what I had this picture of in my head, but instead of the British gas van, because that wasn't particularly relevant to my life, instead of that, it was just this massive hand that I was stood on. And it was like this one world, which was a representation of my current job and where I was living. But I wasn't stood on the world. I was just stood on this hand that was just next to the world. And I just saw the hand just move away to a different world with me still stood on it. And just, I had this like such clear sense of God saying to me, your life is not about the place that you're in, or it's not all about being rooted in that. That doesn't matter. That's not really the main point. The point is that you're rooted in me, and I'm just going to take you to wherever I'm asking you to be. And so it doesn't matter if that's here. You don't have to get off the world. You're just still stood in me, and I'll just take you to whatever the next thing is, which was profound for me because I'd just not experienced anything like that, and it just felt so clear that that's what God was doing. And so eventually I left and moved back home again. Bless my parents. Always there as my little safety net when I'm like, what am I doing? Moved back home with them. I was there for I probably like only 3 or 4 months, looking at other jobs. At this point, I was really looking at youth ministry jobs. Was doing that for a while. And again, I remember having another moment where I was sat at my desk in my childhood bedroom looking at jobs. And I had this real moment of maybe I'm just not cut out for doing youth ministry. Maybe it's just not what I'm supposed to be doing. Maybe I was just wrong. That was probably my first understanding of what spiritual warfare looks like. I think it was like something that I'd heard a bit about, but it wasn't really something that we talked about a lot in the church that I'd grown up in. I had this really clear thought of, maybe I just can't do it. And instantly had this other voice in my head that was like, don't be an idiot. Like, and that again was probably the clearest word I'd ever had from God, which was telling me not to be an idiot, which I just think is great. But it was this sense of course, that's what you're supposed to be doing. Don't listen to that. That's a product of the struggle that it is to find a job and to figure out where you're supposed to be going. But it was a rough time, and eventually I found a job advert for a youth worker or for a girls worker, as it was at the time, at another church whose location I'm not going to disclose. I found this job advert and was reading about the mission of the church and what they wanted from somebody in that role. And it was all very much around like discipleship and mentoring and pastoral support and all of this stuff, which is just the stuff that I see those words in a job advert and I'm like, that's me. That's what I should be doing. So I applied for it in the midst of, all these other jobs that I was applying for and was offered an interview, did the interview, and about a week later was offered the job. And so I moved again to a new place. I actually, when I first moved, I lived with a family from the church. And so literally moved with just a bunch of stuff in my car, drove up and drove just to their house, knocked on their door and was like, never met these people in my life. And was like, hi, I'm Megan. I'm moving into your house. I think I lived with them for 6 or 7, maybe 8 months. And yeah, that was the start of just under 7 years of youth ministry, which I absolutely loved. Had a whale of a time. That is where I met Ruby all those years ago and had about, I guess, just over a year and a half in this role. And then COVID happened. And so everything suddenly stopped, and we weren't allowed to leave our houses except for our 30-minute walk once a day or to buy essentials. I actually remember, so the evening, I've probably never told you this actually, but the evening it was announced that we were going into lockdown, we were at church with loads of the young people running the youth group in the evening, and we'd all seen that there was going to be a big news broadcast. And so we put the TV on at church and gathered round it with all these, this rabble of teenagers. And we saw the announcement that went out to the whole of the UK that was, as of I don't know, it was either like they'd given like a time that night or a time the next day or something. The UK was going into lockdown. And we just
Wow.
all sat there like, oh, okay. So, and when it was the start of all this, nobody really knew what that meant other than we weren't really supposed to leave our houses. Everything had to stop. Schools were going to shut, workplaces were going to shut. It was wild. And to sit there with a bunch of young people who, at the time we had a lot of young people who had really difficult family situations. And so, then as somebody who had some level of responsibility for these teenagers, you're going, so what does that mean for,
Mm.
these 14, 15, 16-year-olds who are now just not going to be able to leave their home life that is really hard. So you're thinking of all those things, and, you're aware that this is a safe space for a lot of them, but you can't offer that anymore. And so what does that look like in terms of how you do your job? How do you keep being responsible for the people that you're responsible for when you can't see anyone and you can't go anywhere? So it was all of these questions, but we've also got all these teenagers in the building who are going, what does that mean about this? What does that mean about this? And you're just sat there like, I don't know. I have no idea. So yeah, that was crazy. That was quite a big moment for youth work. Yeah, everything went online. I actually spent the first 3 months of lockdown completely by myself. I actually didn't have physical contact with another human being for 3 months, which, as an introvert and somebody who is not like, if you've ever done the love languages, like little questionnaire thing, physical contact is not something that's particularly high on the list for me. But when you're deprived of it for 3 months, it's a hard time. And when you've also got this, this ongoing undercurrent of just not being in the best headspace mentally, doesn't do you any good. So that was definitely a big struggle for me, was I mean, what, year and a half really that we were to and fro in lockdown. And then eventually we came out and there was lots of other stuff going on. And I think I really, in terms of like how I was doing mentally and emotionally and probably spiritually, really as well, just got to real rock bottom. And this was probably in 2022, maybe. I had had lots going on. I think it's not super surprising that having spent the majority of all of your teenage years and then all of your adult life so far, dealing with mental illness in whatever way that looked, that eventually you just get to a point where your brain just kind of can't hack it anymore. And so, yeah, things had just got progressively worse, particularly anxiety wise at that point. So um, I was very anxious and it had become quite debilitating. There was starting to be a lot of stuff that I would just drop out of because I couldn't cope with it. I was having multiple panic attacks a day. I just was not existing well at all. And it sort of all came to a head one week, and I basically spoke to my GP and was like, I can't see how I'm gonna keep doing this. I can't keep doing it. And so I was signed off work at that point, which felt like failure to me massively. I think because I'd struggled in one way or another for such a long time. But I think when that starts at the kind of the point where you're transitioning between childhood into your teenage years, and then that's kind of then always how it's been, I actually just had no idea what living without that looked like. I think what made it more complicated for me was that I had no idea what kind of normality looked like. I had no real sense of this is not how it should be. The way that I was existing in a lot of misery, a lot of despair, feeling pretty hopeless about things, feeling a huge amount of fear about things. I had no real understanding that that wasn't just how everybody was existing. And so I just felt like I just was worse at coping with it than everybody else was. And so when I was signed off work, really resisted it because I just saw it as failure. I just thought if I surrender and give in, it means I failed because everybody else must just be living in the same headspace as I am because this is just normal because I thought it
Mm.
was normal. Then that's just admitting that I'm just worse at coping with it than everybody else is, which isn't the truth. That was the kind of reality that I was existing in. And so I went back to a counselor that I had seen a few years before and basically rocked up in her little room and she was like, "So, catch me up. How's everything going?" I was like, "Not well." She said to me, "Right, you're burnt out. You need to take a break. So, the fact that you've been signed off work is a good thing, because if that hadn't already happened, that's what I would be telling you needed to do." She just had a really helpful way of pointing me to notice some things about how I was living that were just obviously not helping me. Basically, work was my only focus because I think it's partly the product of having moved somewhere by yourself for a job. The job is your main focus. I wasn't married then and I'm still not. I didn't have kids then, still don't have kids. And so the stuff that you're balancing, like work just feels like the biggest thing. It feels like you're kind of your only responsibility. And I kind of was explaining how I was processing that to my counselor. And she said something which feels so simple and so not profound, but fully knocked me at the time. She just went, "So who's taking responsibility for you then?" And I was like, "Oh, well, not me, clearly." Or clearly I'm not doing a very good job of it. But my identity was all in work. I wasn't aware of or taking any kind of responsibility for just who I was or who I had been created to be. I wasn't being anyone. I was just doing what I was responsible for. And so, yeah, so then I had a few months of being off work and working through a lot of stuff and just really had to submit to I'm not doing well and I need to sort it out because I can't just live in this headspace for longer. And so sorting that stuff out for me looked like resting. It looked like reframing and rebalancing a lot of my priorities and life stuff. It looked like counseling. It looked like working through various types of medication to find one that was going to help. And I came out of that period like a completely different person and really had that realization of, oh, this is why people can cope with life because they're not holding all of this stuff. And I just hadn't experienced adult life without all of that darkness and stuff going on in my head. I think that really felt like, I think a moment that God really worked with me to reframe. And I think he's still doing a lot of that reframing. Over the last few years, I'm more well mentally than I have been my whole adult life so far. But it's still there a little bit, and it still comes up and then goes away, and then it comes up again a little bit, which I think for a while I've had a lot of frustration around, particularly with, we talked about in our little intro episode that I've moved now. And so I'm not doing youth ministry anymore. And so I've had to move away, start a new job, new community, new church, new area geographically, which brings a lot of anxiety with it and a lot of fear. And it also brings a lot of sadness about leaving familiarity and your home behind and your community behind, which is quite hard when you have to go do that on your own. When I first moved, I was feeling a lot of anxiety again and just had a real sense of, God, I feel like we've worked through this and I felt like I wanted that to be it. I wanted it to be over. I don't want this to keep coming back. And I guess probably in some ways starting to feel like, am I just not a good enough Christian? Am I not faithful enough? Do I not trust God enough? Because surely if I did, I wouldn't be feeling the fear and the doubt and the uncertainty that I'm feeling. But I think even recently, there's been a few podcasts that I've listened to, or a few things that I've heard talked about, or just, I guess, what I've been mulling over in my own head. where I think God has been teaching me again about, I guess, why some of that stuff is still there. And it has I mean, the passage that I've read is in 2 Corinthians, and it's where Paul talks about, because we love Paul, obsessed with Paul. He's got so much good stuff to say. It's this really tiny, funny little passage where he's writing this letter to the Corinthians. He talks about this vision that he has, and I've not read enough into that I really understand quite what was happening with that vision. But then he immediately starts talking about, if you knew this vision that I'd had and you knew the things that I've heard, I could easily boast about that because it was so profound and it was so significant. But I've been given a thorn in the flesh. So he uses this phrase, thorn in the flesh, to keep me from becoming conceited and to keep me from being boastful and proud and all of these things. And he says, 3 times I've asked God to take this thorn away, 3 times I've begged. There's a real sense of desperation. And you don't actually hear what this thorn in the flesh is. He doesn't explicitly say. And so it could have been a physical ailment, maybe it was a mental thing, an emotional thing, a spiritual thing. We don't really know. But he says, I've asked, I've begged, I've pleaded in desperation with God to take this thing away from me. And God's only response to him is, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness.
Mm.
And then Paul's response to that is, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, because where I'm weak, I'm made strong. I've heard that passage lots of times before. And, we quite often hear these helpful pieces of wisdom from the Bible and feel like, oh yeah, that makes sense. What great advice. And then at some point in your life you hear it again and it hits you in a whole other way. And I think with where I've been in my head of why am I still experiencing some of these things? I spent such a long time feeling so much fear. And I do think that God set me free from that consistent, totally consuming fear. I think that He set me free from that and that I've been released from that. But it is still there in some ways, and it's not there in the same way, but it does keep coming back, when I experience different things. And the point of Paul talking about this thorn in the flesh is that sometimes we're just given things that they're not good things. God doesn't want us to be experiencing fear. In fact, there's so much in the Bible that says, do not fear. But sometimes He allows us to be burdened or given these things to hold and to carry because they point us back to Him. And I think I've seen, particularly probably in the last year, where there's been so much change for me, I have seen the way that every time I experience fear, it immediately points me back to God. And it's quite often, and this will be the genius of God somewhere, quite often fear comes up when I'm feeling quite comfy and chill about everything. I'm quite
Mm.
complacent. It's often those spaces where everything kind of feels like quite settled that I don't really prioritize my relationship with God, which is terrible. It makes me sound like an awful person. I just go, well, if everything's fine, then I don't really need you. And I think there's something in probably the human psyche, but definitely in mine, where if everything's kind of okay, I just don't seek God desperately if everything feels fine. And yet, when that fear comes back, and that anxiety, and that panic, and the dread comes back, I'm instantly like, God, you need to help me. Like, I need you to help me because this is too much for me. It's a reminder over and over again that I can't, and I'm also just not created to do this stuff by myself. We are created by God and we're created to do life in partnership with Him, not by ourselves. We're not supposed to be self-sufficient. We're supposed to be weak, broken people in this world since the fall. Obviously, that's not our design initially, but even that, the fall, does that not just point us to how much we need God? All of these things point us to how we actually just can't carry this stuff by ourselves. And so I think even now, that just feels like a really current thing that God's teaching me, this reminder of my weakness and my thorn in the flesh, which I think anxiety is for me, and maybe it will always be like that. But it points you back towards God.
Thanks for sharing. It was so cool. And it was great to hear it as well because I've heard parts of it, but not the full thing. So that was really cool. I guess that's the end of our testimony episode. Shall we pray to finish it? Cool. Thank you, Father, for the way that you've changed Megan's life and the way that you've just walked with her through everything, and even like through the hard moments, that you've taught her more about yourself, and that you've just stuck by her side through it all. I pray that you would bless her and you would keep teaching her more about you and about your plans for her. And I pray for anyone watching who can relate to her testimony, that you would give them courage, and remind them that anxiety is like it's something that can bring us closer to you, and we just need to keep running towards you and not run away from you when we feel anxiety or fear. I pray that you'll remind us that in our weakness, your power and your love and your goodness is made perfect. And thank you for the way that you've just kept by Megan's side through it all. Amen.
Amen. There we go. That's the end. Thanks, Brent Brighton, for listening.
Thanks for watching. Bye. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of the Witness Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at hellowitnesspodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.